Hello, my name's Julio. In a few weeks' time, I'm going to be speaking at Breaking Convention, which is a psychedelic gathering at Exeter University. And my talk is entitled Colonizing the Sacred, the Biopolitics of Psychedelic Healing and How to Respond. For several years, for quite a few years, I've had this issue with the way psychedelics have been slowly but surely mainstreamed through medical and corporate networks. I hadn't expected the corporate side of things to develop so quickly as it did. Initially, in the 2000s, as MAPS was starting to make a name for themselves, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, based in the US, who were moving to look for medical approval for the use of cannabis, MDMA, and psilocybin, but specifically MDMA. It seemed for anti-prohibitionists, those like myself who believe that prohibition is causing a greater harm to society and that the human right of cognitive liberty to experiment with your consciousness how you see fit should be a human right, should be not sanctioned by legal frameworks. It seemed that that course was best served by scientists and medical doctors and researchers making the case for the safety and efficacy of these substances. And over those intervening years, they have been doing some sterling work in that regard. And they really made the case for the medical use of cannabis, MDMA, psilocybin, and even DMT and other substances like ibogaine, which is derived from the West African bark iboga, which is used by the Bwiti tribe in West Africa in Gabon, I believe, to go through rites of passage, deep psychedelic journey in meeting of ancestors, a kind of meeting with the inner mind, inner soul, and has been used by doctors to treat various forms of opiate addiction, but has so many other uses, deeper uses. So, in calling my talk Colonizing the Sacred, I'm making a very specific definition of why I believe that colonization is still the structure that runs many of our institutions, not just in the West, but in every place that the West has touched, which is practically the globe, whether it's the British Empire or the American Empire, which followed it, and all in the guise of a neutral, objective, rational science. Biopolitics is a definition which I'll come to, which is very much to do with the politics of how we administer not just health, but well-being in our society. And the biopolitics of psychedelic healing and how to respond is very much about how psychedelic healing or seeing psychedelics primarily as a way to heal and as a kind of medicine for well-being has been politicized. It's been politicized by claiming to not be part of the political process, to be this neutral science. But I will go on to try and make the case that actually there is a colonial element, an element of control over different cultural viewpoints, religious viewpoints, human viewpoints and knowledge bases around the globe in indigenous communities, in folk communities, in urban communities, and how this one size fits all is a form of colonialism, a form of excessive control, which is actually limiting human flourishing. So the first slide that I have put here is a definition of colonialism in science and politics. I call this type of colonialism white supremacy. I'm not the first person to have called it that. It's a much misunderstood phrase. It relates in some ways to the creation of the idea of whiteness, but there are obviously lighter skinned people of the Northern Hemisphere and concentrated around Europe, and particularly Central and Northern Europe, but not just. Forms of colonialism, of control of peoples in wide scale through conquest and empire. And again, this is not limited to Europeans. It's happened throughout Asia and Africa, different guises at different times. But colonialism, as I'm talking about it here, is really the development, specifically since the Christian Reformation of the 16th century, and the development in conjunction with that, the split between the Catholic Church, which had in its own way colonized most of Europe and then began to colonize other parts of the world. So that conquest, colonization was happening with the Spanish empires and before that Portuguese as well. But the development of the Christian Reformation, the European Enlightenment, and the scientific and industrial revolutions, which all happened between the 16th and the 18th century, was what I might call a perfect storm, which allowed for a certain upscaling, large scale control and colonization of the world. And obviously we know the brutality of the Atlantic slave trade, but it's really as much to do with the scale. And it didn't just happen with technology and with weapons. It also happened with the development, the important development of the Age of Reason, otherwise called the European Enlightenment, which was this development and slow separation, linked in some ways to the Christian Reformation, which wished to dispense with superstition and with claims of divine intervention, other forms of what one might call magic, in favor of this process of rational discourse and empirical observation. So the rational discourse comes through the philosophy of a way of looking at the world, what might be called a new ontology, whereas you had the religious ontology, which was God was at the top. Okay, this was God's creation, and men were subordinates who had to pay respect and abeyance to this divine being, and it was done through the mediation of priests, and that led to a hell of a lot of corruption in the Catholic Church. And so part of the Christian Reformation was a separation from papal authority. And the shadow side of that was really the amassing of wealth, which was used to eventually subjugate further other peoples. But it was very important for the development of Great Britain, in particular the United Kingdom, the Reformation, which allowed, it was kind of like the forerunner of Brexit, but a much more successful version, which separated from the church from Europe and allowed a certain increase in wealth, large increase in wealth. But it was the European Enlightenment and the scientific revolutions which led to the Industrial Revolution, linked to the Christian Reformation because it separated man from God and allowed man to observe God in his own way. And I say man in particular because alongside this came again linked the witch burnings, particularly of the 17th century, 16th, 17th, and 18th century, which really ramped up and was very much in Britain to do with land requisition or acquisition, the Enclosures Acts, which continued for a couple of hundred years, and which really often has been documented by Silvia Federici in her book Caliban and the Witch. It was very much to do with appropriating land, colonizing land, landhold, creating large swathes of land in Britain, which were owned by the crown, and the mainly women who were subsistence farmers and kind of smallholder farmers who would have had access to herbs and all sorts of different ways of connecting with the earth. You could say a kind of paganism, were forced off their land, and sometimes, if they resisted, accused of being witches. And that is one shadow side of the Reformation. And The scientific and industrial revolutions obviously have their positive side, well documented, the advancements in knowledge and technology and alleviation of poverty and hunger. But the shadow side is the creation of other forms of poverty and hunger, and very much to do with extraction of resources, and not just physical land resources, but also human resources in the terms of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. So there is a shadow side to the use of that technology. And again, it's my contention that it's always had its political element. But if you do attempt to interrogate that, you're often accused of being attacking rationality and attacking technological advancements. But actually, you're willing to look at the shadow side of that, how that is used morally through this reduced form of Christianity, which again understand in terms of separating itself from the papal authority, but in diminishing and erasing the feminine element to Christianity, the mother element, the feminine element connected to the Madonna, Mary, the mother of Jesus, according to the mythology or the religion, is really has been documented by ecofeminists an attack on nature herself, the kind of living nature seen as Mother Earth, Pachamama in the Americas, this connection to the earth as a living being, as our mother, that which gives birth to us. It's not an absolute. This is other cultures and societies see this differently, see the mother as the sky, Egyptian culture, and the earth as masculine. So these can be interchangeable in some ways, but generally, as we've come to know it over the past 2,000 years and perhaps further back, there is this connection to the earth as the feminine, and this the nurturing of feminine ideas of compassion and of receptivity, of love, and creating home and hearth, which is somehow separated, and we're creating then from the Christian Reformation onwards, we're creating this more austere kind of, again, it's very easy to see it as masculine, overly masculine, this dark kind of Saturnian, overbearing, hard work and self-sufficiency and individuality rather than community, reciprocity, all of these notions which are human but can be placed for argument's sake in archetypal qualities of the feminine compared to the masculine, or a masculine without the feminine. It's the lack of interchangeability, the yin and yang, the the feminine contained within the masculine contained within the feminine, which is represented by that symbol, the yin yang symbol, where you've got the little dot of white in black and the little dot of black in white. It's the interchangeability, the reciprocity, which allows the flow. It's not about fixed identities, but again, a masculinity shorn of femininity looks for fixed identities. A science and a religion which comes out of the Christian Reformation without its feminine element becomes austere and excessively focused on categorization and on control. So this word biopolitics is like, why not just say politics? I mean, there's something specific with bio, with the biosphere, with humanity, with the way we look after our collective well-being. And two philosophers, both controversial, both very specifically developed theories around biopolitics. Michel Foucault, around in the 70s, 80s, often derided by both right and left as being a postmodernist, this term which is he never described himself as, which is really There is no school of postmodernism, but it's come to mean, especially on the right, but also on the left, as this idea that there is no meaning. This is the understanding of what supposedly Foucault. Now, I studied Foucault at university. I'm not going to pretend to be massively well read, but as I understand Foucault, it's not that he's trying to say that there is no meaning. He's trying to say that so much meaning is socially conditioned. It has been imposed. It's made to look. It's what Gramsci was saying much earlier with his idea of hegemony. It's making something look like it's always been there and it's natural, when actually the institutions, for example, which present themselves health institutions, educational institutions, for Foucault, they were forms of soft power, of soft oppressive power, of making us believe by presenting themselves as neutral, which again comes out of this age of reason, this idea that there is an objective science. It makes you believe that these institutions are benign and objective and neutral when actually they are politically motivated. They can't help but be. And it's not that people are sitting around in a corner planning this in some dastardly way. It's that those who control believe themselves to be offering something objective and fail to recognize their own subjective impositions, which fall through the cracks. So double-blind trials and peer review, they're an attempt to get away from this acknowledged bias, cultural bias that exists with any scientist. The problem is that they've ended up, especially peer review, sustaining that very model of subjectivity pretending to be objective. Giorgio Agamben, again, explicitly of the left, Marxist theory, socialist theory, developed an idea in the 70s and 80s connected to this, which is also to do with biopolitics, which is that governments, the way they can present their forms of oppression and coercion as being necessary is to create conditions in states of emergency, which he calls the state of exception. And it is where you create, despite democratic ways of arranging society, they comes to be presented the need in an emergency of creating an exception to these rational governmental ideas of organization. So they're forms of oppressive control which are presented as absolutely necessary for the state of emergency. But when the emergency passes, that state of exception remains a new, more oppressive law, and we become conditioned to that. Agamben goes a little bit further than Foucault, who talks about these institutions, but does exercising their power, their kind of coercive and hidden power. But with Agamben, this state of exception is explicitly saying there's an aggressive move to make, and we saw it with 9/11 in America, the creation of Homeland Security, which became this extra layer of Secret Service kind of attacks on the freedom of the people in the understandable guise of wishing to protect the people further, but actually becomes a way to create coercive control. Anybody who makes a joke about terrorism at the airport can find himself in prison. There's no inherent evil in making a joke, but it can be used through these emergency laws that are brought in to to take away people's rights, which is like once you take away people's democratic rights, you're left with what Agamben calls homo sacer, bare human. So you're left with an empty human shorn of their legal rights, and they become vulnerable to all sorts of attacks. They are outside, in some ways, outside the state. The thing with Giorgio Agamben, being a left scholar, a very respected left-wing scholar, he fell foul of the left during the lockdown. And lockdown, the coronavirus pandemic was the perfect example of what Agamben had been saying. Again, another state of emergency, a global state of emergency, which allowed for this state of exception, which was lockdown. And vaccines, almost to the point of coercion, not quite, but very close to it. And Agamben was ostracized from the left. No one wanted to touch him. The left had become very much in lockstep with this form of biopolitics, which is about control, that vaccines are a public good, and if you don't take vaccines, you are not contributing to the public good. So this division happened, and there was a lot of resistance, and a lot of the anti-vax groupings were easily framed as far right and right wing. It was much harder to do that, it was impossible to do that with Giorgio Agamben, but still he was ostracized. So still when a view is made which challenges this overbearing institutionalized control, there is a pushback. There is a pushback and ostracizing, no platforming, all of these forms of control. So when it comes to psychedelics, it's again who controls the right to define and administer healing and to what end? This is just the medical world. You can see it in terms of psychedelics, obviously, so much already medical information, scientific information coming in which testifies to their efficacy in alleviating symptoms of PTSD, of trauma, of all sorts of trauma, depression, anxiety, having to go through hoops and hoops to be approved by the FDA, where other medicines such as SSRIs, which have many, many side effects, are considered acceptable medicine. And we have the situation, for example, even in the public sphere, where alcohol, which clearly does more damage than any of the psychedelics on offer, is testified, statistically true, vastly is considered acceptable, but the drugs themselves or the substances themselves cannot get past the legal framework. And now we're getting to a stage where those psychedelics are being cautiously. We need to know more. We need to have more experiments, and it's like putting it through a very strict medical. Only doctors can administer these, and only specific types of psychotherapists, and only in specific circumstances. Who's making these decisions and why? On what basis? This is what biopolitics is about, and asking these questions, which so few in the psychedelic field are asking, I believe is vital. And what I've been banging on about for years is that this is the central theme of whether we have an end to prohibition or whether we have those who need and can benefit from these substances, and also those who can benefit from the treatments, from the risks that are associated with these substances, which are far, far fewer than the risks associated with many of the medicines which the pharmaceutical industry can consider acceptable, that those people with a decriminalized framework can get access rather than this funnel through really expensive treatments, because it has to funnel through the way the health system is set up, which is set up to privilege corporations. So this is all biopolitics. This is all how health is administered, controlled, and defined. So, is nothing sacred? What do we mean by sacred? Again, it's the need to define sacred, spirituality and sacred and sacramental use. All of these things find very difficult to fully define, but those in communities, whether indigenous communities or whether countercultural communities, have their own rituals, their own ways. It's not formalized. Sometimes it's formalized through generations, but even with ayahuasca, there are many different tribes who have different approaches. It's not one standard, some one size fits all, and there are different types of experiences of gods, and it goes right through to psychedelic cultures of the 70s and 80s. The McKenna type, the alien visitations, and a kind of techno alien, and what McKenna has described as what does he call them? Techno, not techno gnomes, but anyway, it's just there are so many different versions, and yeah, it's happening again. It's like, okay, everyone can have these different views, But how do we, what is happening with the scientific research of, well, I believe that again, I call it colonial science. It's not an attack on any individual, but it's a recognition that science, while it has very effective elements which keep it objective, is administered and defined and controlled along lines which are very much down to cognitive bias and cultural bias, and very much connected to the power structures which you might call settler colonial, which stem from uh, British Empire in the 17th century, which go on into the American Empire, and which have now, in different ways, infected the even Chinese structures of government, and Russian structures of government, and Saudi structures of government. It's a world event now that we're looking at science in a particular way, but and religion is looked at in a particular way. Okay, we could talk about Islam and Christianity, but what are these other forms of spiritual experience which are going on in indigenous communities who use plant medicines or plant teachers like ayahuasca or iboga, mushrooms of different kinds? And how do the urban folk who have this spiritual connection, how do they respond to this seeming intent from science to precisely define what spirituality and consciousness are? They're looking for things in the brain. It's a particular type of science which is reductionist, which seeks to look for individual physical evidence, empirical evidence of certain uh, conditions and claims. You're looking for God in the machine. You're looking for spirituality in the brain, which part of the brain is lighting up. It's all useful, but it's not the be all and end all. And any true spirituality or consciousness that's understood through all the different types of religions, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's the Vedas, whether it's different forms of African spiritual practice within the continent, and then same in South America. It's so complex, have so many stories, but they all have some common element. There is a part, the trickster. There is a part that is not able to be fully defined. Certain philosophies talk about the ineffable, can't be defined, and the scientist and the Westerner wants to have a specific definition, and that's the issue. And they want that definition because, well, again, Industrial Revolution and also the growth of capitalism, which happened again in the 17th and 18th century, which is to do with the control of banks, which separated itself from Rome. And Rome and the Jesuits are still a very, very powerful entity in the world. And there are many elements, but that element of the banking system, specifically in the United Kingdom, and the development of capitalism and corporate capitalism has been the most successful form of colonization because it's reached all parts of the world. The financial system is all geared towards that way of looking at maximizing profit. It starts with categorization. You need to have a specific repeatable category, a unit of measurement. Once you've got that, you can commodify, you can turn it into pounds, shillings, and pence. And then once you've got that, obviously anything to do with healing, psychedelic healing, if it's fully categorized and commodified, if it's created as a product, it becomes the tool of corporate medicine, which is where we see medicine has developed over the past 20, 30 years in America, in Britain, even the NHS, which used to be this caring institution of helpers and healers, which of course had science at the center, but it was a much looser collection of people who wanted to deliver well-being for the society, and it was an investment, has now become increasingly privatized, and it's a corporate medicine. So corporations are looking to maximize profit. They're not looking to create healing. They're not, in a sense, healers, but they're in control of the medical system. It's again biopolitics, and they're bringing that law of the market to politics, which is creating a totally twisted view. And when that's applied to psychedelics, it creates even more destructive conditions. There's nothing good that can come out of that. Rick Dublin's idea of net zero trauma is a fallacy. It will always be about maximizing profit. If you can afford those psychedelic therapies, which will cost run into the thousands, when actually to decriminalize mushrooms and to create community centers where people could gather and trip together and share circles. Nothing difficult about that. Needs some special medical approval. It's this standard of approval. You can't quantify that. You can't categorize it. You can't commodify it. So no one's going to want to make it legal because they consider that then a threat to the system of corporate control. And ultimately, that's what it is. So if you want to call me an anti-capitalist for that, that's fine. It's like that's the reality of what's happening. It's the false pragmatism of capitalist realism. This is the way the world works, and then it is the way the world works. And I understand that, but the idea that it's pragmatic is in the long run, it causes more and more destruction because people become destroyed. We are going through a mental health crisis, which has been brought on by this system of extraction and exploitation. And there's only so far you can do that before it starts to come back on you. At the moment, all that wealth, all that physical wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few billionaires, but they have to live on the same planet. Their idea of jumping on a rocket and going to another planet, that's their desire to escape from their own responsibilities. That's what the metaphor is, and the actual of, and we can have a better solution. Some of those billionaires are taking psychedelics; they're not getting the point of those psychedelics. Just taking it on itself, on its own, even with capable scientists and psychotherapists is not enough because the actual truth that comes out and emerges, the countercultural truth, the indigenous truth, is that reciprocity, community, connection, these are the most physical connection, dance, movement, allows emotion to work itself through and then through relational connection, through interplay, through play, we find our true humanity. And then we are in better connection, in better relation with our environment. The pragmatism of capitalist realism that it's all about profit and it's all that has to be done in a way that can be upscaled so that the venture capitalists can make money. That is all doomed to failure. That's basically it. You don't have to be a communist or a conservative or a fascist or an anarchist, anything to it. It's just basic. Even that it can be empirically verified. Though I'm making a claim, I don't have the ability to do that kind of data collection, but it can be done. And I'm telling you, this is a contention. And I think pretty much people who've had the experience over 20, 30 years, who've seen the mental health crisis grow, understand the connection between that and things like the pandemic or things like government excess control and taking away our libraries and social centers, understand that that ends up costing the nation, the world, the earth, so much more. This system of extraction for accumulating profit is destructive, not just to the majority of people and planet, but even to those billionaires who are the captains of this industry. They're not essentially evil people. They're just those who, in the right place at the right time, are benefiting from a system, a structure which is fundamentally opposed to human well-being. And it's until we can see that, we will not improve our situation. It will continue to get worse. But I believe in the power that psychedelics have when unleashed. I just I'm really concerned about the way science and medical people who have a very limited framework, they're not raised or schooled, not all of them, but most of them, to really understand the spiritual aspects, the earth, eco-spiritual aspects, the indigenous aspects. Is one thing to analyze and research and document and create data. It's another thing to actually feel. And feeling doesn't fall into that reductionist type of science. But feeling is the most human quality that we can have, love and fear. And until we understand those life and death, those deep philosophical problems, which psychedelics can help and which our communication with each other can help, then all of this breathless talk of psychedelic renaissance and net zero trauma and all these attacks on each other about individual abuses, which are all important in their own way, but they're missing the point, the greater good, which is the really, we come to the end, you know, the institutionalizing of psychedelic healing, the dangers of medical gatekeeping. I've mentioned that the present imbalance between risk, accessibility, and accountability. So the risks being used as a kind of stumbling block so that the people who need access to these substances now, not when some perfect state is arrived of efficacy. This is not, we're not talking about medicines that work within this structured system that has already caused us grief. There was a much looser approach. Homeopathy was on the NHS a few years back, and then it got universally derided. People benefit from it. Who cares if it doesn't, is not able to be empirically verified? If people are benefiting from it, then who are you to take it away because you need some new standard of specific reductionist proof? That's my issue there. Accessibility. Net zero trauma isn't happening in this present system. It's not happening through corporations funding net zero trauma. There's first of all, that's an impossibility anyway. But if you want to tackle the mental health crisis, then you need massive upscaling of accessibility. And that's not going to happen through this FDA approved trials. And it should be approved anyway. It doesn't need to cross these barriers as far as I'm concerned. There are going to be risks, and those risks need to be addressed. And accountability is important. Where people contravene, there are legal frameworks, but most importantly, there need to be community frameworks so that we can approach these things and work through them. But the idea that individual transgressions and abuses can be used to derail, unfortunately, that's what happened with Symposia Maps and the phase 3 trials. Is Symposia pretended they had nothing to do with it. Oh, the poor me, our critique. Look, the critique was important. The problem was in creating and accusing Maps of being a therapy cult because they used the work of Stan Grof and in attacking Stan Grof for some of his historical mistakes, should we call it, gay conversion therapy, which many scientific psychiatric organizations were doing at that time. To attempt to undermine his whole work on the basis of that, to me seems it's the last thing I would have expected from a campaigning organization of the left to be doing something like that. But in a way, it's not surprising because that form of historical materialism, which stems out of Marxism, and the traditional versions of the radical left tend to be atheistic. They tend to be sneering of anything connected to spirituality, and as such, they have no time for the type of work that Stan Grof and others in the fringe psychotherapeutic communities have been pushing. Even the Albert Hoffman, even Alexander Shulgin had elements of their understanding gained from those psychedelic substances, which you could be termed spiritual. They made these spiritual philosophical claims, which the modern scientist, neuroscientist, policymaker, even symposia seem to be very sneering of. And look, if there were abuses, and I don't doubt that some of those that have been documented by symposia, it's not black and white. I think that some of the work has been really important. If people feel that they were abused, that should be worked through. But the idea that that might influence the FDA to then undermine the whole system of psychotherapy, I don't think it has to be specific type of psychotherapy. Again, there's indigenous use, there's all sorts of spaces. There's even people who go out recreationally and trip together. There are different ways to do this. So the final summation of all of this is that again, it's another buzzword, decolonizing psychedelic healing. And if you believe that there is, and I do believe that there is a colonial mentality, you call it white supremacy, which controls the way medicine is defined and administered, and especially even mental health, then we need to decolonize. And one of those ways, I think, again, is freeing up. The issue of prohibition has been downplayed in this breathless, continuing search for this perfect definition of what psychedelics are, what the psychedelic experience is, so that you can categorize, commodify, and sell it back to us. Well, if we reprioritize to believe in legalization and down to the work of the sometimes really annoying um, over pedantry of, but understandable in one respect, of Daryl Bickler, who says that actually the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 isn't about drugs being illegal, and that when we describe drugs as illegal, we're I don't know exactly what he's saying, really. I mean, it defies me. I get it in one sense, is that, look, the legality and illegality of something that exists as a substance, the possession of which becomes the crime, is down to, again, biopolitics of what we put in our bodies, what we choose to put in our bodies, and who decides that we are a danger. When you actually look, that alcohol is far more a danger to the, not just to the person, but to those around. Whereas people smoking joints are not a threat to people around them, mainly, unless they're smoking really, really strong skunk and they're living in estates, which is again to do with poverty, war, and isolation. It's a completely different matter, but which any drug can exacerbate that. Any substance, you could be on various substances which can distort the mind. We need to reprioritize decriminalization. We need to take the criminal element out of it so that people can get access to help if they need it. People can get access to treatments if they need it, their own way. And there needs to be systems of accountability. But someone might work in a really, really way that's considered way out there. He might be working with angels or with crystals. Who are you to decide that that's not beneficial to the individual? So it's not just the colonial system, conservative system, it's also the colonial left who believe in centralized control, that we know best and we are going to tell you what to do. For a long time, I considered myself on the left, but I was never on this kind of controlled left. I do recognize that authority is important and it's needed at times. I just don't like this idea of forcing certain aspects. There are philosophical reasons why that may be necessary, but we too often reach for it as a society, and governments too often reach for it in order to control. But we have an urgent mental health crisis. So the decriminalization element would allow us to tackle it in a variety of ways, not just one way through the GPs, but lots of groups and methods and methodologies. And in order to do this, we're going to have to challenge what I see as puritanical attitudes, not just colonial attitudes, as I said, puritanical attitudes on the left, dressed up as universal values or safety issues or risk issues. And they are risk issues, but so often they're used to undermine the whole. And that is that hypocrisy that bothers me. And all of this is sustained via repressive medical and legal frameworks. The law, the law, which is really just an excuse to administer power. Unlike Daryl, I don't believe that the legal system, what's written, it's not worth the paper it's written on without something to back it. And medical systems work in much the same way. They're not really about what is written down as safety or non-safety issues. It's all about how language is used, yes, but it's all about intent behind it. So once you've understood that the medical institutions are there to exert control, they know best. When I go to NHS hospitals now, I've never been so clear. I'm noticing the differences, the class differences between the doctors and the nurses and the administration people who work there and the cleaners and receptionists, and the way it all works in conjunction, and it's all about stratification. The posh public school educated doctors, you can see them all 23, 24, 25, walking around like they own the place. They get to decide. And again, people don't like it when I mention class, but it's very much down to we're essentially white, not exclusively, but essentially it's a Oxbridge kind of, I'm in charge of this hospital, I decide, and they protect their own when they fuck up, and they fuck up loads. They fuck up with medicines, they fuck up with treatments, but they have the institution backing them. And there's a process, etc. But as with the pharmaceutical companies, if they have enough money and power, they can defend themselves. If we establish the sacramental value, intrinsic value of psychedelics, not to say that they give a specific type of effect, but they have effects which are mediated by how we approach them. If we establish the sacramental value of psychedelics beyond the reductionist corporatized healthcare, then we can allow these substances to be developed, to have their own creativity, to be modified by our own play. That's what we need to do. And I'll keep on saying this. I'm not an accomplished, polished speaker. My ideas are not rigidly worked through with perfect examples and pie charts with percentages, but I know what I'm saying through my own experience. I can see it and through my own reading. And I've gone through my own issues with ADHD and phone addiction and all sorts of other drug addictions, even because I've not been able to get the substances that I need that do enhance me. Certain types of cannabis oil, certain types of psilocybin. I wish to experience more delving into DMT and 5-MeO because I didn't have positive experiences, but I know that they have potential. The same with ibogaine, which I've never taken. Why boga? Why can't I, because of lack of access to money, not have access to these substances and see if I do need some kind of amphetamine-like uh, substance to focus my mind so that I can write and so that I can read because I do have a scattered mind. Or, other methods. Maybe I do need to get rid of my smartphone. But there's no doubt to me that the simple use, which is easy in this country, of cannabis grown organically and properly, psilocybin, again grown organically and properly, two natural substances that can be rolled out on a massive scale, just that would absolutely decimate the crisis. It would cut through the crisis. It would heal people. And most importantly, especially if done in communal settings, community settings, it will allow people to reconnect, not through alcohol, something that is so damaging to us. We know I like a good, nice drink now and then. I don't mind being inebriated. It's nice. Except people go through rites of passage. Sometimes what the poison becomes the medicine, but there are more effective forms. There's undoubtedly psilocybin is useful. Thanks for listening.